In this video, we want to talk about how expectations change fiscal policy and monetary policy. We said, in the beginning that when we talked about the multiplier, that the model gives us an exaggerated view of the power of the multiplier, right? We said, a marginal propensity to consume of, a reasonable number like 0.6 gives us a multiplier of 2.5. And we don't usually see multipliers of 2.5, right? If we look at the research of multipliers during the recovery from the Great Recession and the financial crisis, we got multipliers of maybe between 1.5 and 2, and that was during a very deep recession. And we think multipliers are much lower during an expansion and could even be less than 1. So one of the reasons that the multiplier is not as large as our sort of original model might suggest is because of expectations. And so we saw in the last video that expectations lead to a steeper IS curve, right? And that means that when we get a change in the policy rate through monetary policy, we're going to get a smaller change in GDP. And so we'll need a larger, change in the federal funds rate to get a large enough change in real GDP. But of course, one of the things that is important is not only how the Federal Reserve changes the current federal funds rate, but what they say about what they're going to do in the future, right, for future levels of the federal funds rate. And this is why the Federal Reserve is very careful when they talk about their policy to talk about how long they expect to keep the federal funds rate at a certain level, right? So sometimes they say, we've cut the federal funds rate and we expect to keep it, at this level for the next, 3 to 6 months. Or, when they're raising rates, they might say, we've raised the rate now and we're going to look next meeting, which will be in 6 weeks or so, about raising it again. And so now that tells the market, okay, they've raised the federal funds rate now. That's an increase in the current R, but they also might raise it in the future. So that's an increase in the expected future real interest rate. And so because we get this sort of steep IS curve, our multiplier is smaller. We also talked about another reason why the IS curve, the multiplier might be smaller, which was because of taxes. And because of imports and exports, which we'll talk about more in the next section of the book. So if we put our IS and LM curve together, we have the IS curve from the last video where it's current GDP depends not only on current GDP, current taxes, and the current real interest rate, but also expected values of future GDP, future taxes, and the future real interest rate. And the LM curve is still going to be the same because we still have just the current real interest rate on the vertical axis of our ISLM model. But that said, monetary policy is going to impact not only the current real interest rate, but may also be able to impact the expected future real interest rate. And that's really important. And that's why the Federal Reserve needs to really think about what it's saying to markets when it changes its policy. So if we have a steeper IS curve, then any shift in the LM curve is going to lead to a smaller change in current output, right? And so that's going to be important, especially if the monetary policy is trying to have a large impact on current output. Then they're going to have to both change the real interest rate by more than they would have otherwise, and also signal about future values of the real interest rate in order to try to change the market's expectations. So this is really sort of what's going on here, right? So if we start at A and the Federal Reserve really wants to increase real GDP. So say we are at a point like we were in 2008 or 2009 during the financial crisis. The Federal Reserve wants to, lower real interest rates, right? So that's the drop from A to B. But then they also want to say, we're going to keep real interest rates low for a long time, which is exactly what they did say. And that, hopefully, would lead to a shift in the IS curve because it's about expected future real interest rates. and that would give us to point C, right? And so these are both monetary policy. And so we always said that the IS curve shifts because of fiscal policy. But now with expectations and the expectations of future monetary policy, we can actually get a shift in the IS curve. And the reason for that is that both businesses and consumers are thinking about, okay, well, what are future real interest rates going to be? And that might change my consumption and investment decisions. So now, hopefully the Federal Reserve, if it's successful, will move us instead of just from point A to point B, all the way from point A to point C and get a much larger change in current output. Now, did that happen in the Great Recession? Well, I think that's debatable, right? Because clearly we had a deep recession. GDP fell, by like 4 percentage points. It was probably about 10% below where it would have been without the financial crisis. But that said, the Federal Reserve responded very differently in 2008 than it did in the Great Depression in 1929, 1930, really all the way through the Great Depression. And so you could certainly argue that the Federal Reserve's response in 2008 and 2009 was one of the things that kept us from having another Great Recession, right? Making it even worse. So one question is really, how rational are people, right? And so when we think about rational expectations, we're thinking about expectations that are formed, in sort of full information, or at least fully informed, as much information as possible, that are forward-looking. And this was sort of what took over macroeconomics in the 70s and 80s, and it was very different from, say, Keynesian economics, right? John Maynard Keynes famously called the sort of expectations that governed financial markets and even a significant part of macroeconomics animal spirits, because he felt that they were not very rational. And sort of throughout the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, as Keynesian economics was getting built, they sort of assumed that either we had static expectations or we had adaptive expectations, right? And one of the things we talked about with adaptive expectations was the change in the Phillips curve, where instead of having inflation on the vertical axis, we have the change in inflation on the vertical axis. And the reason for that is that people form their inflationary expectations by looking at, all right, well, what is inflation, been in the past? Well, okay, I expect that to continue in the future. Whereas rational expectations would take that into account insofar as it's important, right? But they would take all of the other information into account as well when forming their inflationary expectations. And so this rational expectations revolution was really led by people like Robert Lucas and Thomas Sargent. And then it's been getting a lot of pushback over the last 20 years, where we've had the rise of behavioral economics in the sort of microeconomic field, which says that, people aren't always rational, right? People don't have the time, the effort, the energy, the ability to be fully rational. And that has slowly been finding its way into macroeconomic models, but there's still a lot of work to do, because when we're talking about macroeconomics, we're talking about, lots and lots of people, lots and lots of firms. We're talking about government policy. Some of them are going to be more rational than others. How do we model that in, a cohesive way? There's one model by Xavier Gabay from Harvard who says, sort of allows people to have a limited sort of attention span. And so they can focus on, one or two variables at a time, but they're not going to be able to focus on everything. So they have some limited rationality. And that might be a good way to, introduce sort of behavioral economics and sort of people's limited ability to be rational into our macro models. But of course, it's much more complicated than the models that we introduce here.